Um, nice. Probably better not choose that icon though. Um, anyways, because remember, like all of us can see your chat. Um, all right, so I got to turn my camera off because it goofs everything up. Oops. And we're gonna go over here. Sorry, it's been a spell since we've done like a Zoom and slide and all that jazz. So it takes me a couple seconds to be like, okay, I got to do this, and I got to do this, and oops, my email was open, and all that fun stuff. All right, okay, go ahead.
Do you want me to go tell the lady that if like you're supposed to be in this class to get on the Zoom?
Sure, sure. If you want to go ahead and
Because
do
I
that,
know,
I
okay,
will.
because Claudia and Morgan are together, so Claudia's listening too.
Okay, good deal. Yeah, go ahead and do that. I won't cover anything like hugely beneficial while she's working on that piece. Okay. All right. So in that document that you guys had, um, like I was telling everybody earlier, and if you're just kind of jumping on here and just hearing a few things, what I'm going to do for this next week while I try to, get back to being able to be with you guys is as you submit things, if there's things that need to be corrected, I will make comments. I'll give you like this is where you're at currently on your points. And then if you do a resubmit and fix or add the missing pieces, then I will give you the remaining points and I won't remove, there won't be any late point deductions, if that makes sense. So anyways, in your packet, you guys had the directions to work up to the second stop sign of the POGIL, and that's kind of going through our terminology pieces. So my goal for us to kind of quickly get through this class period was how do these things all function together? So if we were to kind of start at the beginning, the ovary is like equivalent in terms of being the production site and being the kind of the driver of the whole system for the female, as the testicle is for the male body. So without the ovary, it is incapable of having a full reproductive system function. Now, I say that with maybe the word full, like underlined and italicized, because what we'll talk about as we kind of go through the next couple of sections is that even if an animal was potentially missing like an ovary, the idea of being a surrogate mother, or being what we would call in the animal world a recip animal, and recip means just shortened and condensed from a recipient animal. They could still be the host for the maturity. They just wouldn't necessarily be the originator of the hormones in the egg. So the ovary produces the female gamete. Gamete is also a terminology word. So gamete is a sex cell. And so a gamete is not only the egg or the ova, it's also the sperm or the spermatozoa. So a gamete is a generic term meaning sex cell. So in the female world, we call that ova, if we're going to use the technical word, or common word would be egg. And in the male, we're going to use the word sperm or spermatozoa. So the ovary produces the gamete, the ova, and it also produces two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. That's a slight difference from the male. The male only produces the spermatozoa and one hormone of testosterone. So within each ovary are hundreds of tiny follicles or cavities. So as weird as this may seem, think of this as like the pores on your face. And whatever female it is, that female is born with a set amount of eggs that it will be able to develop and release throughout its life. That female is not able to grow anymore after she has been born. For example, if that ovary was born and had 100 eggs in it, that's all that ovary would be able to produce. Now, the benefit is there's in all mammals, there's two ovaries. And so if each one of them is set up with 100 eggs, then that's 200 that would be released throughout the lifetime. Okay, so if we think of it like a pore on our face, very similar to like when we talk the immune system, how the Pac-Man, the white cell would come along and kind of like engulf it, and eventually that infection or that plugged pore would rupture up and release. That's exactly what the follicle is going to kind of do, is that when it's time for that egg to be released, the hormones are going to act on it. It's going to rupture up like an internal zit, and it's going to then be released from the ovary. So the oviducts, we don't typically call them oviducts, we always call them fallopian tubes, are the tubes that are going to carry that egg once it's released from the ovary down into the uterus. Now, there's kind of this idea in our mind that it's all connected, but it actually isn't. There's kind of like this tiny space where when the egg is released, it could actually go rogue. And we're going to kind of talk about that here in just a couple seconds. So the oviduct would be a transport tube similar to the epididymis, but in this situation, it doesn't have the job of maturing that ova or that egg cell. Once it's released, it's ready to go. Unlike the sperm, where it takes 3 months or more of going through that epididymis for it to actually be functional and ready to go. So our next one is the infundibulum, and this is actually where I'm going to stop sharing the screen and kind of turn my camera on and maybe hopefully help explain this a little bit better. So I'm going to try to make sure it's not like blinded out with the window there behind me. Let me slide my bench down. Okay, so if we have in the female body, if we were to envision my fist as being the ovary, the oviduct does not like kind of directly connect to it. Actually, what happens is the infundibulum sits right underneath it as if it's like a kind of a catcher's mitt. They are not touching, as you can kind of see. One is like hovering. Now there's some like membranous tissue that holds the ovary in place, but so that it's not like kind of floating all over the place as you move. So there's a membrane tissue, but that tissue does not have a direct connection of the ovary to the infundibulum. So if, for example, let's say this knuckle right here is where that egg was going to be released from. So the hormone comes and acts on it, it swells way up and it ruptures and out comes the egg. So the way it's set up is as the egg kind of would come up and out of there, it would fall down into this infundibulum, which I kind of refer to as the catcher's mitt. And then my arm, my wrist would be kind of like an example of the oviduct and that fallopian tube that carries it on down into the body. But what happens if said little ova egg cell, rather than falling down into the infundibulum, decides to go rogue and go on a little adventure? Is it possible for that to happen? So what would your thoughts be? So this would be where you guys could use the chat, or you could just turn on your mic and tell me what your thoughts are. Maybe. Okay, so if said little egg goes on an adventure, yes, number one, it is possible that the egg would kind of go into outer space and actually just end up in the abdomen of that female animal. It's also possible that the egg would go down into the catcher's mitt, travel down into the, our tube. So we're in the infundibulum, down into the oviduct, gets fertilized, decides, I don't want to go down this route, and goes actually back up. It can be released. And instead of making its way all the way down into the uterus, it can actually attach itself to your intestines, to your liver. And it's what's called an ectopic pregnancy. So EC and then topic pregnancy. Now, is it going to live? What do you think?
No.
You're sort of correct. It can live for a time. So let's think about what would happen when that egg, if it's fertilized and it's an embryo at this point, If it goes and it decides to attach to your intestines, let's say it's going to attach to your small intestines, the very first thing that it has to do is it has to set up an attachment point and a blood supply. So think of it almost like a leech. So it's going to like start sucking nutrients and blood. Could it suck nutrients and blood from your small intestines? What do we think? So yes, no, you guys can use your little icon, or you could use chat or whatever. But yes, it can actually set up a blood supply. Now, if we have this little embryo kind of leaching, sucking blood and nutrients from our intestines, is that going to cause a problem to our intestines? Absolutely, because our intestines are for the purpose of digesting food, and it needs to keep everything internally. But if it's like sucking and sucking and sucking, it could, number one, it could put a hole in your intestines. It's going to start making your body very, very ill. So while it is completely possible for that egg, that embryo to attach somewhere else, it's going to make the female very, very sick. And it's going to be incredibly painful, because the embryo has this task, kind of this like one track mind of, I've got to set up blood supply and nutrient supply. And so in trying to do that, wherever it's attached to, it's going to have that pull. So it would make a lot of pain, very ill. And if it was able to survive for a short period of time, it could be very, very damaging for the female mother. And so typically what happens is that the body will naturally just abort that embryo. There are situations where medically they have to sometimes intervene in humans. That happens more in humans, not so much in animals. Okay, so that's a little bit of a derail from where we were at, but so far we have the ovary, the production site of the egg or the ova. It makes two hormones, progesterone and estrogen. It releases that ova. It falls down into this thing called the infundibulum, which is kind of like a catcher's mitt. It hovers just below the ovary. Then we have the oviduct, which would be kind of like my arm and my wrist here. And it's a transport tube, similar to like what the epididymis would do in the male body. Transports, but in this situation, it doesn't mature, because when the egg is released, it's already mature. So let's go back over to our slides and see what it has to show us now. Okay, we'll share that. Okay, so infundibulum, like I said, it's a funnel shaped kind of catcher's mitt, and we've already kind of covered that. So copulation, which was a term that we learned back in the male unit. Copulation, we learned, was like the actual process of mating or breeding. So when the copulation happens, the sperm is going to move through the female body, and it takes anywhere from 12 to 72 hours for that sperm cell to be able to connect with the egg cell if we're in an ovulation time. So that's anywhere from half a day to up to 3 days. And that's where, when we were in that male unit, we talked about the importance of those accessory sex glands, of providing like a transport fluid, a protection fluid, and also a food source. So it's basically got to keep those cells, sorry, that would be my dog barking in the background. It's got to keep those sperm cells alive for up to 3 days. So once the sperm cell has traveled up through the female tract and has met with the ova or the egg cell, and fertilization happens, that little critter is now called a zygote. It's not considered an embryo just yet, because it's an embryo once it attaches to something. But for like that first little bit where it's still kind of floating along, it's called a zygote. At this point, the fertilization is happening in the oviduct. And that's also another piece that's kind of a misunderstanding. We assume all of this happens in the uterus, and it actually doesn't. It happens up in the oviduct or the fallopian tube. And that's how it's really easy for that that cell, that zygote cell, to now kind of like switch directions and go up and out into the abdomen, as opposed to going down the tract further and into the uterus. So it takes it about another 2 to 4 days after the fertilization happens to actually make it down into the uterus and find its little home where it's going to snuggle in. Okay, so the uterus typically in mammals is Y-shaped. Now, as you guys get ready to do the rest of the packet next week, you'll look and see that you're going to be exploring the whys of why certain animals have a much different shape to their uterus. And so because I'm kind of limited on being able to be with you, that's why I kind of put some hint features, so to speak, as far as like, think about like the size of this animal, or think about the quantity of this animal, or think about its behavior. So like specifically in the cat, what I want you to think about is its jumping behavior, how it can go, from like the floor to the counter, or like, if it's out in a barn or something. Anyways, so it's typically a Y-shaped structure. Some animals, it's a little bit more heart-shaped. Some animals, it's a really unusual, it kind of has this, think like Medusa, Greek goddess, the one that had like the wild snaky hair, except maybe she's only got like 2 snakes, and it's kind of this long traily thing. So in that one, we're thinking like quantity of animals. So the uterus is going to be the home and the host site for where that zygote implants. It develops its like connection piece and its food and blood supply. And then that bullet point there was just exactly what I've been talking about. So if we were to ask, how does the pregnancy occur and develop? It says the upper part of the uterus consists of 2 uterine horns that develop into the oviducts and the fallopian tubes. So think, kind of like I was showing you, my wrist and my forearm would be kind of the, what we would think of as our oviduct or our fallopian tube. And that just kind of naturally would connect down my body into kind of like what would be my torso area. So if we were to envision, yourself kind of like with your arms sort of in like a Y-shaped, that your arms would be kind of representative of that oviduct, and then your torso would be kind of representative of that uterus. It just kind of naturally spreads out and it gets kind of wider and at its connection spot. So my question would be, and you guys can use the chat or you could use the audio, when the pregnancy is developing, do we want that zygote to attach at the top of the uterus, or do we want it to attach at towards the bottom of the uterus? So that would be kind of my question, and I'd be curious kind of your feedback. Do we think it's top or bottom? You can use chat, you could use audio, whatever you guys are most comfortable with. So Willow says towards the bottom. Any other thoughts? So bottom.
I was gonna say bottom, or I was gonna say top, but now everyone's saying bottom, so I don't know.
Well, it's okay to go against the flow. You don't have to agree with everyone else. So Hannah says towards the top, and everybody else is saying towards the bottom. So Hannah, you know what? You actually are the winner for the day. It is actually towards the top.
Yes.
So if we think about this, why would we want the pregnancy to implant and start to grow from the top of the uterus towards the bottom of the uterus, which would be where the opening where the baby could fall out of? Hint, hint. Why would we want it to start at the top?
So it has more room to grow, and then it can come out at the end.
Okay, so as it starts to grow, it's teeny tiny, it's microscopic. It doesn't weigh a whole lot, but as we get further and further along in the pregnancy, it gets bigger in size and it gets bigger in weight. And so it's pushing on the bottom of the uterus, which is the area that's actually going to open to release it. So if that pregnancy started at the bottom, wouldn't that potentially cause that kind of gate to open too early? And so that's why I was kind of wanting you to think about it like, okay, it needs to attach at the top and then grow so that it spreads out the length or the size of the uterus. So that way it's not putting too much pressure on that opening that we're going to talk about here in just a minute. So parturition, again, one of your terms, is literally the process of birthing. And so for each animal, we have different terms. So like if you are having a baby cow, it's called calving. If you're having a baby goat, because we call a baby goat a kid, they call it kidding. Or if it's a sheep, it's lambing. If it's horses, it's foaling. And for pigs, it's farrowing. It's kind of an unusual word there, but it kind of goes back towards like the history of feral pigs. And that's where we come up with that farrow word. So let's see what we got here. We'll go ahead on to, so the gate that I was kind of mentioning at the bottom of the uterus actually has a technical name. It's called the cervix, but I like to definitely emphasize its importance as a gateway. And normally that gate is shut and locked during pregnancy because that hormone progesterone is saying, nope, you shut the door, shut the door, shut the door. That's what the job of progesterone is it keeps this cervix shut. Now, if at any point during the pregnancy, if the body says, not feeling it, not going to produce progesterone, then all of a sudden this cervix or this gate could have the potential of opening too early, and it could cause the animal or the female human to go into early labor, or it could cause like an accidental kind of abortion, not a medically induced one, but like where it's been done externally, but something that the body would do. And those types of situations happen. In a human, we most often would refer to that like as a miscarriage or preterm labor. In the animal world, we don't use that terminology. We just say that it was a natural abortion. And basically what it means is that we've had some sort of system failure. So whether the cervix came open because it broke open, maybe the gate wasn't strong enough. Maybe it came open because the progesterone dropped. Maybe it came open because of some sort of an illness. In the animal world, we just kind of use that one generic term. In the human world, we have other terms for it. So again, the job of progesterone is to maintain the pregnancy. And the job of the estrogen is actually to act on the ovary and get that egg to be released. So each of them has their own role. And if you were to track the cycle, while one is high, the other one is low, and they kind of go back and forth and back and forth. They do not function at the same level in the body, because if they did, it would send the body into a mass confusion. If the estrogen was high saying ovulate and the progesterone was also high saying maintain the pregnancy, the body's going to get very, very confused. So typically you will see that either estrogen is high or progesterone is high, but they're typically not the same at the same time. So on the inside of the entire reproductive tract, it's lined with these mucosal cells. So if you were to kind of just put your tongue to the inside of your cheek and feel that kind of like smooth, that dampness, that is essentially mucosal cells. If we were to embed this zygote, that later turns into the embryo at like day 2 to day 4, if we were to embed it into something that was potentially able to dry out like our exterior skin, it would be very hard for that pregnancy to maintain itself. You got to remember at the point of the fertilization all the way up until this, the majority of that cell, of that zygote turning into an embryo cell, the majority of it is going to be water. So it needs to be in an environment that's going to maintain that moisture. And that was kind of one of the questions that was at the beginning is, why do we think that the pregnancy is internal rather than external? And it's a lot to do with needing to maintain that moisture, but also think about what would happen potentially to that embryo if it was external and you were laying out on the beach and just soaking up some fabulous sunshine. What could potentially happen to that? Well, in essence, we could overstimulate it or accidentally cook it if it was exposed to the outside. So that's why it's very much protected on the inside. So gestation, one of that last terms that was added on there, it basically just means pregnancy. And for each animal, it's a different amount. Some animals compared to humans are exactly the same, or then we have an example of like the elephant where the female is pregnant for 2 years. Having had children of my own, I could not imagine being pregnant for 2 years straight for just being able to produce one offspring. That would be excessively long. So as we then prepare to kind of exit the body, the vagina is kind of our exit, but also kind of like the location where the sperm cell is going to be deposited. Sometimes people kind of question, why do we need kind of like an entry way, or kind of like like when we're coming into the school, how we have like a double set of doors. The way the female mammal is set up is it has kind of that same concept where it has like a double doors. It has the exterior, and then you enter into kind of like the vagina area, and then you have another set of doors, which would basically be the cervix before getting all the way into the uterus. And it literally is just for the protection of trying to eliminate germs. So it's trying to restrict them into one area that has the ability to continuously self-clean and remove any of that kind of dirt or debris that would come in from the environment. And so that's really what the job of the vagina is it kind of is that like in between. It's like that in between the sets of double doors. It's where the sperm can be deposited. And it serves as a canal in and out of the birthing process, but it also has the job of eliminating a lot of germs that especially when we're dealing in the animal world where they're running around in the in the wild or even in confinement. It's not like we are providing them with that protection layer to eliminate germs and disease. And so this is also just like in the male system, this is where the bladder is going to kind of begin to show its presence. So the female reproductive tract will cross over with the urinary tract exactly the way that the male reproductive tract crosses over with the urinary tract. So that all also occurs in the vagina. And again, like I was saying, that kind of concept of the double doors, we don't want the potential germs that the urine is going to introduce into that area to be able to have like a direct admit into the reproductive tract. And so that's why we have that gate, that cervix that kind of eliminates that passing. So then the last piece would be the vulva, which is the external opening. And that's the piece that as animal owners, we would, be able to observe as, is this an animal that is expressing that it's in ovulation, or what we would call in heat. And especially when you're dealing with livestock animals, we watch those things very carefully because when that heat starts to happen, we will see that testosterone behavior in males start to increase. So that aggression or that kind of natural curiosity or the desire to be in the same vicinity as the female. And so we kind of talked in the male unit of like, why do producers of livestock utilize the concept of castration? And it's simply for number one, it's safety, but additionally, if we were to leave all of those male animals intact and allow them to mature, if they were, for example, to be used as a meat item, that meat would be unusable because the testosterone would affect the taste so much that you would find it repulsive in odor and also repulsive in flavor. So that's one of the primary reasons in the livestock industry why they utilize the idea of castration is because if we're going to use the animal as a meat source, we want to not have it contaminated by the hormone of testosterone. All right, so there's your kind of final picture. That's the concepts that I wanted to cover for you for today. You can kind of see up there, if we look at that little circle, which this is very much a kind of computerized drawing. In reality, if you were to look at the ovary, it is not this perfect little golf ball looking thing. It's actually quite unusual looking. It probably looks more similar to your fist than what you would think. It's several lumps all kind of like clustered together. And then you can see that light yellowish would be our infundibulum or our catcher's mitt. Then we have the oviduct of the darker orange. And then it would, like I said, it kind of like naturally just becomes part of the uterine horn. So we would have our implanting of our embryo somewhere in this range so that it has the ability to grow down and around. And oops, I didn't mean to do that. And then here would be our cervix or our gate that our progesterone is going to act on and seal it shut. So that way it has the ability to kind of close this chamber off, keep it germ free, and allow it to develop that pregnancy. And then again, kind of our vagina area where the urinary tract overlaps. We're trying to keep any germ or contamination confined to this area because this area has a continuous kind of self-cleaning process to keep germs out of the body. So I'm going to stop sharing, turn my camera back on here and just see, are there any questions related to those pieces of material that we've covered? So I'll go ahead and stop